It was an ordinary afternoon at Chicago International Airport, bustling as always, with long lines and hurried people. In the midst of the rush, Audrey Hayes, a black woman in her 50s, waited calmly in the executive class line, holding her boarding pass for New York. She wore a discreet navy blue suit and carried a leather briefcase, one of those that betrayed someone accustomed to positions of authority. She had just attended a high-level legal conference and, despite the visible fatigue on her face, maintained a firm, almost unshakable posture. To an onlooker, she appeared to be just another successful professional returning home after days of meetings. But there, in that small slice of time and space, what should have been a simple wait would turn into something much larger. A few meters away, leaning impatiently against one of the queue dividers, was Abigail Prescott. Blonde, impeccably made up and with a look that wavered between boredom and superiority, she wore a Hermes scarf and spoke in a tone far too loud for the setting. She had noticed Audrey as soon as she arrived and had been keeping an eye on her ever since, as if trying to decipher something that in Abigail's eyes made no sense. The discomfort was evident, the presence of a black woman alone, without any visual indication of celebrity or obvious wealth, occupying that space which Abigail considered reserved for her own kind. The unease grew quickly, fueled by a mix of prejudice and arrogance that she made no effort to hide, and that was when she decided to act. Prescott discreetly approached an airline attendant, whispering something with a grave and concerned air. The employee, visibly taken aback, tried to keep his composure but ended up giving in to the urgency in the woman's tone. She claimed she had noticed strange behavior on Audrey's part. Suspicious glances, unusual movements near the baggage area, all fabricated. Nothing more than a carefully staged lie, bolstered by her status and the security that only social privilege tends to provide. In less than 5 minutes, 2 police officers were already making their way toward the boarding line, summoned by the control center based on a report that hadn't even been verified. The officers who arrived were Dave Riley and Sean Baxter, 2 names that, at that moment, meant nothing to Audrey. The first, already graying and with a tired expression, walked with a false calm, as if his authority were unquestionable. The second, younger and impatient, carried in his eyes the desire to find trouble where perhaps there was none. As soon as they stopped in front of her, the people around fell silent. Audrey looked up, not understanding the reason for the approach. Riley was direct. He wanted to know what she was doing there, if she had a boarding pass, and if she could show some identification. There was no greeting, no attempt at a polite explanation, only suspicion, only judgment. Audrey, without raising her voice, calmly handed over her boarding pass and an official photo ID. She knew she had done nothing wrong and had no reason to get upset. Still, the tension in the air was palpable. Riley took the papers, glanced over them, but did not seem convinced. It was as if the facts didn't matter in the face of the impression that had already formed in his mind. Baxter, standing beside him, crossed his arms and looked at her as if waiting for an incorrect reaction to justify a harsh action. The questions began to become more invasive. They wanted to know how she had bought the ticket, if she was alone, where she was headed afterwards. Audrey, steadfast, answered everything, but the discomfort grew. When she firmly asked for the officers' identification numbers, the atmosphere shifted. Riley let out a dry, sarcastic laugh. Baxter leaned forward, visibly irritated. The idea of a proud black woman demanding accountability seemed to be a personal affront. "Do you know who you're talking to?" The unspoken phrase was evident in their eyes. Audrey, for her part, remained upright, her eyes fixed, refusing to be diminished. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't being disrespectful, but to those men, the mere fact of not bowing was provocative enough. And that was when Riley gave the order. "Let's take her for further investigation." As soon as Riley touched Audrey's arm, she instinctively recoiled. She said there was no reason to be taken away, that she had already presented valid documents, and asked once again for the reason for the approach. But this time, Baxter sprang into action. Without hesitation, he grabbed her other arm with unnecessary force, as if dealing with someone who posed a real threat. Some people around began to discreetly film with their cell phones, while others averted their gaze, uncomfortable yet silent. The metallic sound of the handcuffs rang out loudly, out of place, almost absurd in that setting where nothing justified the scene. Even handcuffed, Audrey held her chin high, her eyes fixed on the faces of those surrounding her. She did not beg, did not scream, and perhaps that was what annoyed them the most. The officers escorted her through the terminal as if she were a high-risk criminal. Baxter gently pushed her from behind, while Riley strode ahead with large steps, parting the crowd of passengers. The handcuffs bit into Audrey's wrists, and a dull pain began to rise up her arm, but she did not complain. All she could hear in the background were the muffled murmurs of those watching everything without really knowing what was happening, or pretending not to know. At one point, someone quietly asked what she had done. Another responded with a shrug, as if accepting the most convenient version. As they passed by a child holding the mother's hand, Audrey felt the curious and innocent gaze of the little girl, who watched her until she disappeared through one of the side doors. In that moment, the shame was not hers, but still, it hurt as if it were. In the small security room of the airport, Audrey was placed in a plastic chair against the wall, still handcuffed. The environment was cold, with white walls and a camera pointed toward the center. Riley sat behind a table and began asking questions in a brusque tone, ignoring the fact that all the documents had already been verified. Baxter, restless, paced back and forth as if expecting something to explode at any moment. Audrey answered with precision and calm, stating that she was an American citizen returning from a legal conference and that she demanded to speak with a lawyer. Riley laughed cynically, saying that everyone is a lawyer when they have a problem. That was more than disrespect. It was an attempt at provocation, at diminishment. During what they called the standard procedure, they removed her shoes, searched her purse, and examined her documents once again. Everything was done with mechanical coldness, but laden with veiled disdain. Audrey observed every move, recording faces, voices, gestures. It wasn't the first time she had faced racism, but it had been a long time since she felt so exposed, so vulnerable, and at the same time so aware of what that represented. When they asked again if she was sure the boarding pass was hers, indignation began to show in her gaze. She was not there just for herself. Every question laden with suspicion was a reflection of something larger, something structural, and she knew it. Still, she waited. She waited for the right moment. When Riley mentioned that she could be charged with obstruction and passive resistance, Audrey understood that the line had been crossed. He spoke as if he had already decided the outcome, as if he were playing a game where the rules did not apply to him. Baxter, on the other hand, seemed eager to grab some registration form. Audrey took a deep breath and asked for the third time if they knew who they were dealing with. This time, she said nothing more. She only looked directly into the room's camera, with the serenity of someone who trusted that eventually all of this would be seen, reviewed, and held accountable. It was as if she had pressed a silent button, triggering a countdown to an inevitable turnaround. The arrival of the officer responsible for screening, already in the custody area, marked the beginning of that turnaround. A middle-aged man with a technical gaze took Audrey's documents and began making the standard entry in the system. It took only a few seconds before he stopped typing, frowned, and looked again at the full name on her functional identification card: Audrey M. Hayes. His gaze fixed on her, then returned to the screen, and then to the two officers. There was a moment of strange silence. The man slowly stood up, left the room without saying anything, and closed the door behind him. Riley snorted impatiently, but Audrey did not react. She crossed her handcuffed hands on her lap and waited. Outside the room, the officer in charge made a phone call in a low and serious voice. In less than 5 minutes, 4 calls had been made. Audrey's record was there, available to any federal system, yet he wanted to confirm directly. When the internal security supervisor appeared with two federal airport agents, the atmosphere changed. One of them carried a folder with printed copies, and the other, with an even graver expression, requested immediate access to the room where Audrey was. Riley and Baxter did not notice the movement at first until the door abruptly opened and the supervisor entered, accompanied by the two men. The silence inside the room was absolute. Audrey lifted her gaze and then, calmly in a firm voice, said, "I am the Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals." The reaction was immediate. Riley turned pale, as if he had been physically struck. He tried to say something, but the words did not come out. Baxter stood motionless, unsure whether to look at the judge, at the federal agents, or at the floor. The supervisor, embarrassed, asked for the handcuffs to be immediately removed. Audrey gracefully extended her arms, and the handcuffs were released without her having to get up. The sound of the metal clattering on the table sounded like a verdict. No one spoke. The federal agents explained in a low voice that the internal affairs had been alerted and that judicial authorities were on their way. Riley attempted to justify the approach, but was firmly interrupted. "You will be removed immediately, and all recorded actions will be sent for federal analysis." Oh. While Audrey was escorted to a reserved room, away from public view and the involved officers, the backstage of the airport turned into an operations center. Direct calls were made to the Department of Justice, and within an hour, 2 federal officers and a representative from the Supreme Court were already on site. A U.S. Marshals agent was assigned to personally accompany her to boarding, and her luggage, previously left at the terminal, was carefully retrieved. However, Audrey did not seem concerned with any of that. Seated in an armchair, with her hands free and her gaze fixed on the void, she appeared to be digesting what had just happened. It was not the first black woman to go through this, she knew, but perhaps it was the first time that someone with so much power was on the other side of humiliation. And with witnesses, Riley and Baxter were immediately removed. There was no farewell, nor any apologies. They were escorted out of the room, one with a tense, closed face, the other in shock, as if he had not understood the gravity of his own actions. Abigail Prescott, for her part, had vanished from the boarding area as soon as she saw the officers return silently, followed by an unusual movement of suited individuals and official cell phones. However, the video of the moment of the arrest was already circulating on social media. Within minutes, Audrey's face appeared on passenger profiles and complaint pages under the headline, "Black Woman Arrested in Executive Class for No Apparent Reason." What many still did not know was who she really was, but that was about to change. When Audrey's full name began appearing in posts, along with her title, the internet reacted like an avalanche. Newspapers started calling court advisors, and news channels rushed to confirm the story. In less than 2 hours, the faces of Riley and Baxter were also exposed, identified by attentive users who cross-referenced names in forums and public records. The story was no longer an isolated incident. It had become an image crisis for the airport security, the local police, and in a way, for the entire country. Meanwhile, Audrey was speaking on the phone with one of her court colleagues, recounting the details of the incident with the same calm with which she would announce a sentence. There was no anger in her tone, only precision. Abigail Prescott, on the other hand, couldn't escape for long. A passenger in the adjacent line had discreetly recorded the moment she made the report, with exaggerated gestures and an anxious voice. The video went viral, with captions such as, "The woman who called the police over racism." When her identity was confirmed, Abigail Prescott, heir to a real estate fund, the repercussion hit the social circle she most prized head-on. The next day, she tried to publish an apology, but it was already too late. A civil lawsuit was filed, and to avoid a scandal in court, Prescott agreed to pay $500,000 in fines for false reporting, moral damages, and inciting abuse of authority. Money would not erase what had happened, but it signaled that the weight of the consequence had, at last, fallen on the right side. In the days following the incident, the repercussions spread like wildfire. It was not just the case of a woman unjustly detained. It was the revelation of how racial prejudice, even disguised as zeal for security, still operated forcefully within institutions. Audrey did not give interviews. She also did not make any immediate statements. She preferred the strategic silence of someone who understands that there is more power in what is built calmly than in what is shouted in haste. While the world debated her story, she returned home. She entered her apartment in Washington, placed her bag on the sofa, and removed her shoes, as if finishing another day of work. But that night was not ordinary. She sat in front of the corridor mirror and observed her own expression. She saw firmness, but also fatigue. She saw dignity, but also a painful trace born of a long history of dealing with looks like Prescott's and abuses like those from Riley and Baxter. This had not begun at that airport. It had merely found a stage there. In her office, the folder with the conference documents was still on the table. She opened it and leafed through the notes from the lecture she had given, The Role of Impartiality in the Modern Judiciary. She smiled without humor. It was almost ironic. A woman who taught about impartiality being treated like a criminal simply for existing in a space others thought she should not occupy. She picked up a pen and wrote a handwritten note. Impartiality is not the absence of emotion. It is the presence of conscience. That would drive her in the days to come, when she decided to call for a public hearing on discriminatory practices in institutional security environments. As Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals, she had enough authority to propose a review of protocols and, more importantly, to put racism and abuse of power on the judicial agenda with the force of someone who had lived what most only discussed from afar. Instead of turning the episode into a spectacle, Audrey would transform it into a movement. Every detail of what she experienced would be used to force concrete changes, because she could. Because she must, and because she knew that, if not her, perhaps no one would. The public hearing convened by Audrey was scheduled for a Monday morning in the Federal Court building, in one of the largest rooms, with capacity for the press and live transmission. It was unusual for such a senior judge to publicly expose a personal episode, especially one involving humiliation. But Audrey did it not for herself. She did it for all the people who, every day, experience similar situations without the weight of power to protect them. When she entered the room, she wore the same navy blue suit from the day of her arrest, a silent gesture of symbolic reappropriation. She sat at the center of the main table and looked around. Representatives from civil organizations, lawyers, journalists, community leaders, all were present. But what caught the most attention was the number of black faces in the audience. Many had come not only to listen, but to be seen. It was a kind of silent recognition. She was speaking for them as well. Audrey began the hearing with a direct, unembellished account of what had occurred. She spared no details. The tone of the officers, the pressure of the handcuffs, the way she was exposed before everyone. But what captivated everyone was the way she wove that episode into a larger pattern. She cited data on racial profiling at airports, statistics on filed complaints, cases of settlements that never reached the press. She spoke about how institutional silence usually protects the abusers and silences the wronged. There was no inflammatory speech, there was precision. Every word she spoke seemed to carry exactly the weight needed. At one moment, she looked at the representatives from the Department of Security and said, with a firmness that did not require raising her voice, "What happened to me is not an exception. The exception is that I had proof. Most do not." The silence that followed that phrase lasted long seconds. A silence that was not empty. It was full of guilt, of discomfort, of embarrassed recognition. That hearing was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, and everyone present knew it. After the hearing, the impact was immediate. In less than a week, the protocol for approaching passengers at federal airports began to be reviewed by a special task force. Several airlines started requesting anti-racist training for their employees. But not everything was an official response. Much of what moved came from social networks, from articles published by columnists who used Audrey's story as a mirror of what so many others had experienced, though invisibly. Some messages arrived at the court's institutional email, written by strangers saying, "Thank you for not staying silent," or "I never thought someone so powerful could go through this, but now I understand how cruel the system is." She read some of these messages between sessions, and although she did not respond, she kept them all, because it wasn't just about laws, it was about humanity. It was about reminding everyone that even the woman who signs sentences with the seal of justice on paper is, above all, a person. One afternoon, a few days after the hearing, Audrey passed through the lobby of the very same airport where everything had happened. She wasn't there to board. She had been invited to participate in a meeting with the terminal's management and security representatives as part of the institutional reconstruction effort. But crossing that same space with the same shops, the same seats, the same floor where she had been humiliated was more challenging than she had imagined. She walked with her usual firm posture, but inside something pulsed, not fear, not resentment, but a kind of bodily memory that triggered sensations hard to describe. When she passed in front of the old executive class line, she caught sight of a younger black woman with headphones and a wheeled suitcase waiting to board. Their eyes met for a second. There were no words, just a discreet nod, a contained gesture that said everything. Audrey continued on with lighter steps. That did not erase what she had experienced, but it was as if, in that silent exchange, she were passing an invisible baton of resistance, of presence, of continuity. The judicial process against Riley and Baxter moved quickly, thanks to the public exposure and the weight of Audrey's name. But for her, it wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. During the testimonies, she chose to appear in person, even when her presence wasn't required. She wanted to look those two men in the eye and ensure that they fully understood that what they did was not just a misconduct error. It was a reflection of a system that trained, allowed, and for far too long, protected them. When questioned at the hearing, Riley tried to justify his actions with the classic excuse of excess zeal. But even he did not seem to believe his own words. Baxter, younger and less experienced, cried during the hearing, apologizing and saying he was only following his partner's command. Audrey did not respond. She did not smile. She did not react. She only wrote something in her notebook and kept her eyes fixed on the bench. That posture of someone who neither bows down nor seeks revenge was more powerful than any verbal reply, and perhaps more painful for them than a heavy sentence. The verdict came down hard. Both were convicted of abuse of authority, excessive use of force, and violation of civil rights. Riley received a prison sentence under a closed regime, while Baxter, for having cooperated and shown remorse, had part of his sentence converted into mandatory community service in anti-racist education centers. Audrey did not attend the final reading of the sentence. She had already done what was needed. That day, she was visiting a public university where she was to speak with young law students. The room was full, and when she entered, the applause was spontaneous. But what stood out was not the warm reception. It was the moment during her lecture when a young woman raised her hand and asked, "How did you manage to remain calm even when treated that way?" Audrey smiled, took a deep breath, and replied, "Because they weren't just testing me. They were testing everything I believe in, and I couldn't let them win." That phrase was recorded on cell phones, in notebooks, and most importantly, in the memory of everyone present. It wasn't just a response. It was a lesson about strength, dignity, and purpose. In the following months, Audrey returned to her routine at the Court of Appeals, but nothing was exactly the same. Not because her behavior had changed. Her punctuality, her precision in votes, her ethical posture remained intact, but because the world around her had changed the way it saw her. Now, every time she entered a room, there was an added layer of respect, not just for her position, but for her courage. There were also, of course, those who whispered, who doubted her intentions, who said she was politicizing justice. But Audrey knew that neutrality is a luxury for those who have never had to be reminded of their own place. And she had long chosen not to ask permission to exist. Instead of protecting herself, she exposed herself. And with that, she strengthened others. Young black lawyers who now saw in her more than just a title. They saw living proof that it is possible to be powerful without losing one's humanity. One late afternoon, as she left the court, Audrey walked alone to a cafe near the court headquarters. She sat at the last table in the room, ordered a tea, and watched the street activity. There, in silence, without fanfare, she allowed herself to breathe. She thought of her mother, who had worked for years as a nurse and used to say, "A black woman will always have to walk twice as much and still smile along the way." She also thought of her daughter, newly graduated in biology, and how she had called after the incident, emotional, saying, "Mom, now the whole world knows who you are." Audrey had simply replied, "They always knew. They were just pretending not to." That wasn't bitterness. It was realization. She had never needed to prove anything, but now she had shown everything. And she knew that carried a cost. The exposure, the wear and tear, the responsibility of becoming a symbol. But there was also beauty in that, because when a symbol is true, it inspires without the need for spectacle. The case, although legally closed, still sparked debates in universities, forums, and even in high school classrooms. It became a case study in law courses, was cited in international panels on institutional racism, and turned into a reference in training sessions for security corporations. What began with a cowardly racist gesture by a passenger became a lever for reforms and a spark for change in sectors where injustice had been normalized. Audrey had never wanted to be a celebrity, nor a martyr, but now she was an example, and that required constant presence, extra attention, and above all, integrity. She accepted this new role without any romantic notions. She knew that the fight for equity never ends, but each concrete advance is a stone firmly laid along the path. And she had placed an entire rock with that episode, not for reacting with fury, but for resisting with composure, not for shouting, but for remaining, not for victimizing herself, but for striking back with truth. That night, as she placed the last papers in her bag, Audrey heard a court intern on the other side of the room ask if she still remembered that day at the airport. She paused for a second, looked out the window at the darkened sky, and replied without turning, "I remember. But what matters most is what I did after it." That phrase did not make the newspapers, nor was it posted on social media. But those who heard it kept it, because there lay the core of it all. The day of injustice was not the end. It was the trigger, the moment before truth, before the turnaround, before the rebuilding. Audrey did not forget what happened, and would never forget. But she chose not to live in that moment. She chose to transform. And for that reason, on that very floor where one day she was handcuffed for no reason, other women now walk with greater certainty, knowing that if one day they are questioned, they can look those who doubt in the eye and say with confidence, "I belong."